A newborn survived just 17 minutes, but what doctors found inside that delivery room would shake the medical world forever. The infant's DNA revealed something so disturbing that files were sealed for over 60 years. This wasn't an accident of nature. This was the deliberate result of nearly a century of family secrets so twisted that even hardened scientists couldn't believe what they were seeing. On a chilly autumn day in 1932, a pregnant woman arrived at St. Mary's Hospital in rural Virginia. Staff members exchanged worried glances as she registered using a fake name, her fingers shaking while filling out paperwork. Nobody realized that the baby inside her would become the most shocking medical case in history. A real example of secrets so horrible that relatives would spend generations trying to hide the facts. Hi there. Before we continue, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment telling us your location and when you're watching. This helps YouTube recommend more stories like this to you. The baby delivered that freezing November evening had more than physical problems. Medical files kept hidden for 6 decades and only revealed through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit show something much more alarming. The child's genetic code revealed a history that would make experienced scientists doubt everything they understood about human biology. This went beyond simple inbreeding. This represented generations of it. Multiple levels of genetic confinement so absolute that when experts finally created the family diagram, they found something that defies natural laws. The mother, let's call her Sarah, carried no papers when she checked in. She talked in an accent so heavy and outdated that even longtime local staff had trouble understanding her words. Her clothes were sewn by hand. Her body showed clear evidence of a life spent far away from modern society. But her gaze disturbed the workers most. Empty and distant, as though she lived in a reality none of them could perceive. What took place in that birthing room on November 15, 1932, would terrorize everyone there for their remaining days. The doctor on duty, Dr. Margaret Hayes, would later record in her personal diary that she had brought thousands of babies into the world throughout her profession, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have readied her for what came from Sarah's body. The newborn survived exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes that would transform medical understanding forever. But this tale doesn't start with Sarah, and it definitely doesn't finish with her nameless baby. To grasp what truly occurred in that hospital chamber, we must journey back almost 200 years to an isolated mountain valley in Appalachia, where one family's terrible secret would spread like a disease through each generation until it created the most genetically damaged human ever recorded. The Holloway clan first arrived in what neighbors named Devil's Hollow back in 1847. Jacob Holloway, a man escaping unpaid bills and rumors of wrongdoing in Pennsylvania, led his wife Martha and their 7 kids into the remote valley carrying only 2 wagons and a fierce desire to vanish from proper society forever. What he discovered was ideal for his plans. A natural stronghold of rock formations and thick woodland, reachable only through one slim passage that could be easily monitored and protected. Jacob wasn't simply running from people he owed money to. Legal documents from Philadelphia found only in 2019 during academic research show that he faced accusations of inappropriate relations with his own daughters. The criminal charges disappeared when important witnesses suddenly changed their stories, but the harm to the family's standing could never be repaired. So Jacob gathered his secrets and his disgrace and traveled toward the mountains where nobody would ever question him again. The valley itself felt doomed right from the start. Earlier inhabitants had left after just a few seasons, insisting the ground was somehow wrong. Native Cherokee people had stayed away from the location for generations, naming it the place where spirits grow sick. But Jacob recognized only opportunity in the remoteness. Here his family could follow their own customs, obey no power except his, and maintain their bloodline pure in ways that would make even him uncomfortable in his final years. Martha Holloway gave Jacob 3 additional children in that valley before she passed away under questionable conditions in 1854. The county sheriff, limited as he was, traveled out to look into her death, but encountered the family so unfriendly and the landscape so dangerous that he simply recorded it as death by fever and never came back. What he failed to discover was that Martha had learned something about her husband's nighttime trips to their daughter's sleeping areas, and that her passing had been anything but from illness. With Martha deceased, Jacob's authority over the family became total. He created what he labeled the natural order. A structure of forced marriages between brothers and sisters and cousins that would keep the Holloway blood concentrated and the family's secrets hidden from the outside world. The oldest daughter, Rebecca, was wed to her own brother, Thomas, when she reached 16. Their first baby, delivered in 1856, marked the start of a genetic disaster that would repeat through 6 generations. By 1860, the Holloway family had expanded to over 40 people, all residing in a group of poorly built cabins linked by secret trails through the forest. They communicated in their own language, followed their own corrupted form of faith, and lived by rules that existed nowhere else on the planet. Government workers taking the census never located them. Tax officials learned to skip the area after 2 vanished in back-to-back years. The Civil War raged nearby, but Devil's Hollow stayed untouched, overlooked. A zone of darkness expanding deeper with every new generation. Thomas Holloway, Jacob's son and spouse to his own sister Rebecca, took over as the family's second leader when Jacob died in 1871. But Thomas was unlike his father. Where Jacob had been calculating and measured in his wrongdoing, Thomas was controlled by something much more basic. The decades of inbreeding had already started showing their damage. Thomas experienced violent emotional outbursts, episodes of total mental absence, and what current mental health experts would identify as serious developmental problems. During Thomas's rule, the family's separation became even more absolute. He established harsh penalties for any relative discovered talking to strangers. And the occasional mountain hunters who accidentally crossed their land reported odd sounds coming through the valley after dark. Screaming, singing, and other disturbances that made tough men move faster and never look back. The genetic damage was becoming too obvious to dismiss. Babies were arriving with additional fingers, absent limbs, and face malformations so extreme that some could hardly swallow or inhale. But instead of viewing this as a danger sign, Thomas understood the mutations as evidence of heavenly blessing. Evidence that the family was evolving into something above human, selected for a unique purpose that demanded absolute genetic concentration. Rebecca Holloway delivered Thomas 11 babies over 18 years, but only 6 lived beyond their 5th birthday. Those who survived carried the combined harm of 3 generations of deliberate inbreeding. The family diagram rebuilt decades afterward from medical files and witness statements shows that by 1880, the typical level of inbreeding inside the Holloway family exceeded what's normally observed in laboratory mice bred intentionally for genetic studies. The 4th generation represented a critical moment in the family's fall into genetic nightmare. Thomas's surviving kids, Mary, Joseph, Samuel, Elizabeth, Ruth, and Abel, were matched in marriages that violated every principle of nature and society. Siblings wed siblings, uncles wed nieces, and in certain instances, fathers claimed their own daughters as partners when no other acceptable matches could be identified within the bloodline. The children produced were living proof of humanity's genetic boundaries. Many arrived with problems so critical they never mastered walking, talking, or even identifying their own faces. But within this 4th generation, Sarah was delivered. The young woman who would ultimately arrive at that Virginia hospital pregnant with the most inbred baby in medical records. Sarah resulted from a relationship between her grandfather Joseph and her Aunt Elizabeth, making her simultaneously a great-granddaughter and a granddaughter to the identical man. The genetic specialist who eventually examined her family diagram would invest 3 days tracking the links before finally giving up and calling the entire arrangement genetically impossible, yet somehow actual. Sarah Holloway came into existence in 1912 with chances already impossibly against her. Delivered to parents who possessed over 75% identical DNA, a genetic matching that shouldn't happen outside identical twins. She was a walking survival miracle wrapped in a horror of inherited destruction. Her birth weight barely reached 3 pounds. Her head was oddly shaped and her left arm stopped at the elbow in a mess of incomplete bone and tissue. But Sarah survived, and that alone was remarkable. Of the 12 babies delivered to her parents over 15 years, only 3 lived past their first year, and Sarah was the single one capable of something close to typical mental ability. She mastered walking at 4, uttered her first words at 6, and by adolescence, she had become somewhat gifted within the warped limits of Devil's Hollow. A young woman who could understand the few decaying books the family owned, and even compose basic letters in a tight, unsteady handwriting. The family leader during Sarah's lifetime was her great-uncle Abel, a man whose own genetic harm had made him almost 7 feet tall but with the brain function of a young child. Abel controlled through terror and irrational beliefs, delivering a distorted message that declared the family's physical problems as sacred marks. Signs of God's unique focus that would eventually change them into heavenly beings on earth. Under his guidance, the family's spiritual customs had transformed into something that would have disgusted even their forefathers. Ceremonies using blood, bones, and behaviors that medical experts still won't describe fully. When Sarah reached 18 in 1930, Abel selected her spouse in the customary family method by randomly choosing among her male relatives. The selected match was her own uncle Marcus, a man 43 years older, who had already fathered 6 severely handicapped children with 2 of his nieces. Marcus was himself the outcome of 3 generations of sibling unions, and his genetic information looked like a list of everything that could fail with human DNA. The wedding ritual, led by Abel himself in the family's crude chapel, was observed by 37 family members, most showing visible evidence of the genetic catastrophe that had consumed their bloodline. Pictures from that occasion, found in a chest buried near the family graveyard, display faces that appear almost inhuman in their deformity. Eyes positioned at strange angles, limbs bent into abnormal shapes, and looks of blank bewilderment that suggest minds fighting to understand a world their injured brains could never completely grasp. Sarah's first pregnancy arrived quickly but terminated in miscarriage at 6 months when the developing baby was discovered to have grown without a working brain stem. Her second pregnancy continued only 4 months before her body naturally expelled a child that medical notes label simply as incompatible with life. But her third pregnancy, the one that would bring her to that Virginia hospital, was unusual. This baby not only reached full development but appeared to be growing normally, at least based on the basic checks done by the family's unofficial midwife, Marcus's sister Delilah, who had gained her knowledge delivering the damaged children of Devil's Hollow for over 30 years. If you're continuing to watch, you're already stronger than most. Share in the comments what you would have done if this was your family line. By October 1932, something within Sarah had shifted. Perhaps it was mother's instinct, or perhaps it was the first spark of clear thinking breaking through 6 generations of genetic confusion. But she started to recognize that the baby developing inside her needed an opportunity at life that Devil's Hollow could never offer. The family's latest births had been progressively terrible. Infants delivered with internal parts outside their bodies. Children with faces so distorted they couldn't take in air. Newborns whose skeletons were so fragile they fractured during birth. Sarah reached her choice during what the family named the Night of Screaming, when Marcus's newest child, delivered to his 14-year-old niece, existed for 6 painful hours while its incomplete lungs gradually filled with liquid. As the baby's sounds rang through the valley, becoming fainter with each hour passing, Sarah felt something break within her consciousness. She wouldn't allow her child to become another victim of the family's perverted heritage. Her departure strategy was basic but frantic. During the new moon in late October, when the valley was blackest and the family leader Abel was deep in one of his spiritual states, Sarah crept away from the settlement with only her worn clothing and $17 she had taken from Marcus's secret hiding spot. She had never traveled more than 5 miles from Devil's Hollow in her whole existence, but panic provided her bravery that 20 years of training had never permitted. The trek almost ended her life. 8 months pregnant and drained by lifelong poor nutrition, Sarah trekked for 3 days through mountain territory that would test a skilled outdoorsman. She lasted on wild fruit and creek water, resting in stone shelters and rotted tree trunks, pushed onward by an obsession approaching insanity. The unwavering belief that her baby earned better than the genetic nightmare it had been created in. When she eventually collapsed out of the wilderness onto an actual roadway, Sarah was confused with weariness and sickness. A door-to-door salesman named Robert Welsh discovered her fallen beside his vehicle, speaking nonsense about demons and celestial beings and infants that cried with sounds like shattered glass. Welsh, an honorable man with daughters himself, placed Sarah into his automobile and headed directly to the closest hospital, never guessing that he was carrying the final product of America's most terrifying genetic trial. At St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah registered using the false identity Mary Smith, a trick that succeeded only because her situation was so clearly urgent that nobody doubted her tale of being a deserted wife with no relatives to reach. The medical staff, familiar with handling mountain residents who were frequently doubtful of current medicine, believed her unusual accent and strange reasoning for her clear genetic problems. What they couldn't believe, what none of them were ready for, was what came from her body on November 15, when Sarah's contractions eventually started after 3 days of medical issues that confused the treatment team. Dr. Margaret Hayes had brought over 3,000 babies into the world in her 30-year profession, but nothing in her training had readied her for what she observed in Delivery Room 3 on that freezing November evening. The labor itself had been remarkably tough. Sarah's hip structure was distorted from her own genetic harm, and the infant appeared to be arranged in positions that contradicted typical childbirth understanding. But when the baby finally appeared, Dr. Hayes grasped she was viewing something that would disturb her for her remaining existence. The newborn was breathing, but hardly identifiable as human. Its head was stretched and partially sunken on one side, creating an almost pyramid appearance that made the enormous eyes seem to protrude from their openings. The left arm was totally missing, finishing at the shoulder in smooth tissue, while the right arm had 7 fingers organized in a design that indicated the limb had tried to form as 2 distinct appendages. Most unsettling of all were the baby's legs, which were joined together from the hip downward in a single mass of flesh that held what looked like 3 different sets of bones. But the external deformities were only the start of the terror. As Dr. Hayes conducted her opening check, she discovered that the baby's inside structure was equally disastrous. The heart was functioning, but its pattern was unpredictable and erratic, pointing to severe design problems. The breathing was strained and weak, showing that the lungs were either underdeveloped or located incorrectly inside the chest area. Most concerning of all, the newborn displayed no reaction to illumination, noise, or contact. Its nerve pathways appeared to be so destroyed that it existed in a condition that could hardly be named consciousness. The medical group worked frantically to steady the baby, but their work was blocked by the reality that typical infant methods simply didn't function. Regular oxygen-providing techniques were pointless because of the malformed facial design. For placement was almost unachievable due to the lack of standard blood vessel positioning. Even fundamental measurements were difficult. How do you measure a baby whose form seems to exist in dimensions that don't match regular human structure? Dr. Hayes chose to contact Dr. Edmund Carver, a genetics expert from the University of Virginia who had been examining inherited problems in remote communities. Carver showed up within hours, examined the newborn once, and instantly started recording what he would eventually call the most severe instance of genetic compression ever noted in medical writing. He calculated that the baby's parents possessed over 90% matching DNA, a degree of genetic likeness that reached the theoretical boundaries of what human creation could achieve. The baby existed for precisely 17 minutes. During that short period, Dr. Carver succeeded in gathering tissue specimens and capturing images of the newborn from every conceivable position, building a record that would afterward become the basis for revolutionary investigation into the impacts of extreme inbreeding on human growth. But as the baby's irregular heartbeat ultimately ceased, everyone in the chamber recognized that they had observed something that went beyond typical medical occurrence. They had witnessed the final result of humanity's darkest drives made real. Sarah, medicated and drained from the traumatic birth, was informed only that her infant had been delivered with critical complications and had not lasted. She received this information with an odd peacefulness that disturbed the medical workers, as though some portion of her had always understood that her baby was fated from the instant of conception. Dr. Carver's investigation into the Holloway family situation would cover the following 40 years of his profession. But it was investigation performed in complete privacy. The genetic information he had gathered was so alarming, so far outside the limits of typical human difference, that he worried its release would either be rejected as invention or worse, applied to support the type of selective breeding programs that were becoming fashionable in 1930s America. Instead, he secured his discoveries in a personal safe, revealing them only with a small group of reliable associates who were promised to silence. Sarah herself vanished from the hospital 3 days after delivering, abandoning only a message written in her cramped penmanship. "The devil's work is done. I go to make peace with God." Hospital workers believed she had gone back to whatever mountain settlement she had originated from. But the reality was much more sad. Sarah's remains were located 2 weeks afterward at the base of a cliff 50 miles from the hospital. Her passing determined a suicide by regional officials who never linked her to the puzzling situation at St. Mary's. The Holloway family tale might have finished there, interred alongside Sarah in an unmarked burial plot, if not for a chain of chances that started to develop in the 1970s. Family history investigators working on Appalachian ancestry began to observe odd absences in the documented record. Complete bloodlines that appear to disappear without reason. Population records that displayed impossible family connections and regional stories about a doomed valley where evil itself was claimed to exist among the residents. In 1984, Dr. Carver ultimately ended his quiet. Now in his 80s and confronting deadly illness, he concluded that the world required knowledge about the Holloway family, not as an oddity or a reason for shocked interest, but as an alert about the final results of genetic separation. His published research titled Extreme Consanguinity in an Isolated Population, a Case Study in Genetic Collapse, showed up in the Journal of Human Genetics and instantly became one of the most debated releases in the discipline's record. The research disclosed that the Holloway family represented something never seen before in medical writing. A genetic restriction so intense that it had basically formed a new type of human existence, one so distant from typical human genetics that conception with strangers would have been nearly unachievable even if the family had wanted it. The baby delivered to Sarah in 1932 wasn't simply badly deformed. It was the result of a genetic trial that had been operating uncontrolled for almost 100 years. An accidental examination in the complete boundaries of human inheritance. Devil's Hollow itself was ultimately found by investigators in 1987, almost 60 years following Sarah's departure. The valley was vacant by then, its crude structures fallen and consumed by nature, its secrets interred beneath decades of dropped foliage and mountain quietness. The family burial ground held over 200 plots, most without markers, many holding the bones of babies and youngsters whose existences had been ended early by the genetic disaster their forebears had released. Currently, the Holloway situation remains as both a scientific achievement and a moral warning narrative. Present-day genetics researchers examine Dr. Carver's information to better comprehend the workings of genetic illness, while ethics experts apply the family account to demonstrate the significance of genetic variety in human groups. But most significantly, the account functions as a notice that some secrets are too horrible to remain concealed, and that the expense of separation, genetic, community, or ethical, can repeat through generations long following the initial wrongs have been erased from memory. The most inbred baby ever delivered existed for only 17 minutes. But its influence continues to form our comprehension of human genetics almost 100 years afterward. In those quick moments of existence, that unnamed newborn held within its harmed cells the gathered burden of 6 generations of family secrets. A living proof of the blackest depths of human character and the horrible cost of maintaining some truths hidden in darkness.